If you are a middle or high school teacher, you may think that completing a training on phonics and phonemic awareness is not a good use of your time. After all, phonics and phonemic awareness are taught in elementary schools, right? Well, if your classroom enrollment includes children from poverty, kids with cognitive or developmental delays, English language learners, bad spellers, or students in general who struggle with reading fluency or comprehension, then you may find the information in this video more useful than you'd think. Convincing elementary teachers of the value of phonics instruction is relatively easy. After all, making letter-sound connections and building on that knowledge to teach children how to decode and then to read words fluently are crowning accomplishments for young readers and their teachers alike. Nevertheless, skilled early childhood educators will tell you that phonics and phonemic awareness instruction do not cast a broad enough net to ensure that pre-literate students become competent readers. In fact, researchers consistently argue that phonics and phonemic awareness should not be the primary focus of instruction with respect to early childhood literacy, nor should its programming exclude children from rich literacy experiences. After all, when it comes to literacy development, all roads lead to comprehension. Since phonic, phonemic awareness, fluency, and vocabulary all work together to improve reading comprehension, recognizing weaknesses in these areas and knowing how to address them can make a dramatic difference to your instructional bottom line, regardless of the grade level that you teach. In this video, we'll explore phonics and phonemic awareness as they relate to ELLs and other struggling learners in an effort to align these two key elements of literacy instruction with effective standards-based teaching. As the brain learns to read, it is constantly sifting through a multitude of sensory data, looking for patterns and processes. Once identified, these patterns and processes become stored in short-term memory. If they're repeated with enough regularity and receive reinforcement, whether consciously or subconsciously, the information is subsumed into our long-term memory. If it is not repeated or reinforced, the brain deletes the information to make room for more pertinent knowledge. Synaptic connections help the brain assign symbolic information, such as language, to similar or related information within our cognitive storehouse of meaningful experiences. It does this as a means to efficiently organize, store, and assist with the retrieval of related concepts and language. You may remember the word lexicon from an earlier video in this series. A lexicon is a group of words related to the same topic or idea. When we know and understand the vocabularies related to a concept, we can more easily manipulate language to critically engage in the learning process. This idea applies to listening, speaking, reading, and writing on the macro level, and the same general idea applies to language learning on the micro level. Every language contains a collection of distinctly different sounds, or phonemes, and corresponding symbols, or graphemes, that are used to communicate ideas. Knowing the alphabet letters and the sounds that those letters make is called phonics. Students use phonics to decode words, which in turn contributes to their reading fluency. By contrast, the ability to hear and manipulate sounds in spoken language is called phonemic awareness. Research tells us that a student's skill in phonemic awareness is a good predictor of later reading success or difficulty. We also know that phonemic awareness instruction should be individualized to meet the specific needs of each child in the classroom. Why is individualized phonemic awareness instruction so important? When ELLs engage in English literacy development, they often find it difficult to make the sound-to-print connections that are required of them to master reading fluency. This is particularly true for students like those from China, Korea, and Saudi Arabia, whose native alphabets and sound systems differ so dramatically from those used in the English language. The human brain is not born with the insight to make sound-to-letter connections, nor does it develop naturally without instruction. For most children, their native language phonemic system is well established during infancy and early childhood, so assigning new meaning to these concepts can create some confusion unless they get specific feedback adequate exposure to target concepts, and sufficient reinforcement of new learning so that the brain can recognize it as new and link it to previously stored relevant data sets. Many children have begun developing pre- and early literacy concepts in their native languages before they enter school. For older students, a fully developed native language phonemic system and a working knowledge of content area and literacy concepts may already be well established. Ultimately, the way that individuals encounter reading is culturally and linguistically informed, and the information stored as the result of that learning can serve as valuable background knowledge which can support English language and literacy development. In order to effectively plan for individualized phonics and phonemic awareness instruction, it is helpful to first have some understanding of how your students' native languages compare and contrast, linguistically speaking, to English. Since the brain is constantly looking for patterns and systems, an ELL must critically analyze what he already knows about language and literacy against the same skill sets as they are used in his new and developing language. For pre- and early literate ELLs, the sound-to-print relationships of English learned in school may not be consistent with those of their native languages. For example, the letter I is pronounced E in Spanish, and the letter E is pronounced E. The Spanish letter H is always silent, and so is the Spanish vowel U, but only when it is preceded by a G and followed by an E or I, as in the word guisantes. As the result of these and other phonetic differences, native Spanish-speaking ELLs sometimes have trouble decoding English words, a phenomenon that may be easily observed when beginner or intermediate ELLs take spelling tests, read aloud, or produce authentic writing samples. By providing brief whole group phonics instruction that is contextualized within the lexicon of your unit or lesson, and responding to the unique linguistic challenges of the struggling learners in your classroom through individualized instruction, you can help learners improve decoding skills. This, in turn, will improve vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. When working with struggling learners, it is helpful to recognize what knowledge and understandings they do bring to the table, because this information can be used during instruction to help their brains more efficiently store and retrieve information about language, literacy, and subject area knowledge. English is a tricky language for non-native speakers to master. It is not tonal. It follows very strict but often nonsensical grammar rules. It is not a phonetic language. And along with a very wide lexicon, the English language also has many very different dialects. There are 26 letters in the English alphabet, whose letters make 44 phonemes, or distinctly different sounds. As if that weren't challenging enough, there are more than 1,100 ways to spell the sounds of those 44 phonemes. This condition is one major reason that English is a difficult language to learn. Unlike English, many languages such as Spanish, Italian, Turkish, and Czech have alphabets with a high grapheme to phoneme correspondence. That is to say, their letters generally have one sound per letter, and their letter combinations consistently reinforce that sound symbol pattern. ELLs from these language groups may find learning to read and write in English challenging because English word sounds and their spellings are not consistent. Since the grapheme to phoneme patterns of English cannot always be applied with fidelity, the ELL brain sometimes lacks the cognitive reinforcement that it needs to recognize divergent patterns, contrast them with similar patterns that have already been stored, and correctly file the new information into long-term memory for easy retrieval and later use. If you are a native speaker of English, a lifetime of exposure to and contextualized application of these irregularities have helped you acquire language and literacy in ways that minimize errors with respect to phoneme to grapheme connections. However, it is not unusual for even native speakers of English to commit an occasional spelling or pronunciation error. We can blame these oversights on the inconsistent patterns found in our language. Nevertheless, the The sporadic nature of English spelling and pronunciation rules can put even an accomplished reader to the test. To illustrate this point, please stop this video and read The Chaos, a poem that highlights 800 of the most common irregularities in English spelling and pronunciation. A link is provided here for your convenience. Clearly, ELLs and other struggling readers need direct instruction and extensive exposure to important subject area content, presented both orally and in writing, in order to become successful readers and well-educated individuals. In order to achieve high levels of English literacy development, students need to both see and hear the language of the content area used meaningfully and in context. It is useful to point out word parts, word families, cognates, rhyming words, common spelling patterns, unusual spellings, homonyms, and common errors in both spelling and pronunciation as part of your instructional delivery to meet this end. When creating language objectives for your standards-based lesson plans, be sure to consider what potential barriers might exist with respect to pronunciation, spelling, and reading fluency, as these are all influenced by phonics and phonemic awareness. If you're a secondary teacher and your students take notes in class, compare the notes of an ELL with those of a native speaker of English. The spelling errors you may see in that sample would likely reveal a combination of the incorrect transfer of knowledge from the student's first language and a limited, albeit developing, understanding of how to apply the various sound-to-letter combinations of English. If your ELLs are not taking good notes in class, it is possible that the challenges posed in this video are preventing them from doing so. Giving them a copy of your lecture notes may seem counterintuitive, since you want them to stay engaged during your lectures. However, if your students are left with incomplete information and cannot focus on understanding because of barriers caused by weak English literacy skills, it makes good sense to provide a language-reduced alternative. One way to do this is to provide a word bank and a copy of your notes with relevant vocabulary missing from each section. As students follow your lecture, they can find and apply the correct vocabulary and make native language comprehension notes in the margins or in other spaces provided. Encouraging students to use a symbol system that will help them pronounce words correctly by applying their native language phonemic system is another useful strategy. For example, when pronouncing the word trade, a Spanish speaker could write TREID, enclosing the phonetic spelling in brackets can help him remember that the notation is a bilingual code for an English pronunciation. Other phonemic awareness activities include rhyming games, spelling challenges, language scavenger hunts, dictations, songwriting, and word study. Using American Sign Language to appeal to learners' tactile kinesthetic learning preferences is another great way to reinforce the sound-symbol connection while teaching vocabulary and spelling. You can sign alphabet letters as a subtle error correction strategy, or simply to reinforce key phonemic concepts with minimal disruption to the class. An additional strategy, and a fun way to draw attention to common spelling or pronunciation errors, is to create a word wall jail for difficult vocabulary. Should a troublesome pattern emerge, simply put the offending word in jail until the class masters the target language or concepts and sets the word free. Using a word wall in your classroom can really help visual learners internalize spelling patterns. It can also help you and your students retrieve words for use in context while engaged in content area speaking and writing. These productive language skills require focused practice, using target vocabulary in context. This practice is essential to the mastery of academic standards, and it is critical to learner success on standard-based assessments of that knowledge. So how else can we as teachers help the brain recognize and store new information? Clustering words on spelling tests according to patterns in the spelling or pronunciation of the words, and teaching those clusters explicitly to draw attention to their phonetic or graphemic arrangements draws attention to the way words look, sound, and behave. Venn diagrams, T-charts, and quadrants are excellent graphic organizers for this type of activity. You can even ask students to sort words on your weekly vocabulary lists according to patterns that they perceive themselves. Another idea is to ask students to identify target spelling or vocabulary words from the lesson or unit that you're about to teach as part of its introduction. You can ask them to do a word search, using the assigned readings from the chapter and related handouts to identify new and troublesome words. This activity lends unique insight into what learners really find challenging. Oftentimes, the words they choose are different from the ones that you'd anticipate to be a problem. Finally, whether you teach 3rd grade or 12th, it is worthwhile to create weekly spelling tests with words drawn from the vocabularies discussed in our previous lesson, to ensure that students are able to recognize, spell, and use target vocabulary that comprise the critical 85% of words used in instruction and on standardized tests. These practices can help students develop accuracy and automaticity, two important features of reading fluency, in ways that are both language-rich and language-reduced. The key, of course, is to help struggling students distinguish sounds and spelling patterns to facilitate learning. ELLs whose native languages contain silent letters, sounds that do not exist in English, or writing systems that are distinctly different from the target language may be especially challenged to make meaningful connections through literacy to subject area knowledge. As you select meaningful phonics and phonemic awareness activities to embed into your lessons, be mindful of the specific needs of learners whose languages fall into these categories and adjust your teaching accordingly. Asking students about their native languages is a great way to build trust and mutual respect in the classroom. In addition, it may elicit instructional conversations that engage critical thinking, reinforce learning goals, and empower children to explore their own unique skill sets as they assume greater responsibility for their own learning. Let's stop for a moment to connect the concepts shared in this video with your own standards-based lesson planning. During our lesson on vocabulary development, you generated a word list that your students will encounter in an upcoming lesson plan. These included words related to your subject area, process language used to establish behavioral or performance expectations, idiomatic expressions, various facets of English structure, and cognates, or words that have similar pronunciation and meaning in two languages. Today, we've examined the critical role that decoding, pronunciation, and spelling can play when teaching all language learners. We've also considered the advantages and potential caveats of language transfer and the implications for ELLs. Think about the words generated from your lesson plan in terms of phonics and phonemic awareness. What patterns or systems can you find that might require explicit phonics or phonemic awareness instruction? What are 3 new strategies presented in this lesson that you could employ immediately to enhance these skills among struggling learners? Finally, how will you incorporate these strategies into your standards-based lesson plan? Now that we've considered how phonics and phonemic awareness can impact learning and planned for ways to implement their instruction into your standards-based planning and delivery, let's take a look at this type of instruction in an Oklahoma public school setting.